Firelight warms a circle of faces, while a voice threads the night with battle cries, oaths, and laments, and a boy leans closer to hear a name he already knows, Rostam. Around the brazier, the story is not a pastime, it is a map of how to live. This episode asks how the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, carried memory and identity across centuries. The core idea is simple. Stories maintain a map of values, and the Shahnameh kept that map updated, portable, and shared. Because families recited it, cities copied it, and craftsmen painted it, the poem taught what courage looked like, what justice felt like, and what loyalty cost. An epic, in plain words, is a long narrative poem that gathers a people's past into memorable scenes. Apply that here. Some 50,000 couplets move from creation to kings to heroes, with voices that teach through example rather than lecture, which meant listeners could borrow strength from characters without needing a classroom. Fix one date to hold the story. Around 1010 CE, Ferdowsi of Tus finished the Shahnameh after decades of composition and revision. Next, bookmakers, patrons, and performers took over the work of carrying it forward. First, the family scale. Parents repeated favorite episodes, Rudab's courage, Zal's patience, Rostam's hard choices, so the poem lived at bedtime as well as in courts. Because the verses were patterned and musical, children learned them fast and kept them long. Next, the city scale. Scriptoria in places like Herat, Tabriz, and Isfahan copied lavish manuscripts whose miniatures filled workshops for years. Copying made employment, and employment made pride. Therefore, the poem didn't just speak values, it trained hands, shaped guilds, and linked neighborhoods to a shared project. A nakal is a professional storyteller who performs epic scenes with voice, gesture, and a staff. In tea houses and squares, nakals turned lines on a page into public theater, adding proverbs and local color while keeping the bones of the tale. This performance culture kept the Shahnameh social, something done together, not merely owned. Because the poem is a mirror, rulers looked into it. One concise example is the theme of just kingship, where a ruler listens, weighs, and restrains anger. This ideal influenced court ceremony and city justice rituals, in which officials staged open hearings to be seen as fair. It was not politics in the narrow sense, it was behavior modeling backed by story. The poem also worked as a language anchor. Its Persian was clear and sonorous, rich in native vocabulary. Reciting it gave speakers a shared accent across mountains and caravan routes, which meant a merchant in a distant bazaar could join a verse begun by a stranger and feel at home for the length of a couplet. Because the Shahnameh is large, it holds multitudes without losing focus. There are duels, feasts, councils, omens, and reconciliations. There are victories that feel like losses, and losses that teach more than a sermon. Therefore, it could travel from house to palace, from frontier to capital, without changing what it meant. Copying practices mattered. Scribes learned to pace lines, artists learned to stage battles, and binders learned to protect thick folios with lacquered boards. Each craft added its discipline to the poem's durability. If a leaf tore, a copyist mended it. If a manuscript wore out, another took its place. There was and remains room for debate inside admiration. Listeners could argue whether a hero chose well, whether a warning was heard in time, whether fate or pride caused a fall. Because the poem allows such questioning, it invites ownership without demanding uniformity. Distance never stopped it. Caravans carried compact copies wrapped in cloth. Scholars exchanged verses in letters. Travelers brought local tunes for familiar lines. A person might forget a date, but a half-remembered rhyme would pull an episode back into place. If, then, nuance belongs here. If a region favored a local hero, performances leaned into that lineage. If a city prized fine calligraphy, its copies emphasized script over image. The poem bent without breaking, which kept it recognizable and near. Memory, like trade, needs infrastructure. Schools recited genealogies of kings alongside grammar. Poets echoed motifs in new songs. Historians used episodes as scaffolding for their chronicles, which meant the Shahnameh formed a quiet backbone for education that was not restricted to a single class. Because values require tests, the poem shows costs plainly. Heroes misread signs. Promises strain under fear. Victory sometimes demands an apology. Listeners learn that strength without judgment is brittle, and generosity without limits may turn blind. The river of time changed its banks, and still the story crossed. When cities rose or fell, manuscripts moved with families. When patrons changed, workshops adapted styles while telling the same scenes. What remained constant were the virtues staged again and again. Courage balanced by counsel, force corrected by justice. Here is a cause and effect chain in everyday words. Because people remember better through narrative than instruction, the Shahnameh taught by plot. Because plots travel better in verse, the Shahnameh lasted. Because it lasted, it became a standard. And because it became a standard, rulers and citizens alike measured acts against it. Therefore, the poem was not merely entertainment, it was calibration. One evening, picture returns us to the firelight where we began. A reciter pauses at a difficult moment. The audience breathes as one. An elder nods because he knows the next line, and also knows what it once meant to him in a moment of choice. The story is old, but the decision is always new. The poem's map of values includes courage shaped by restraint, revenge checked by law, and pride softened by counsel. These are not abstract lessons. They guide how to treat a stranger, how to keep a promise, how to serve without losing one's name. Cities that lived with these stories built customs that rewarded patience, memory, and measure. Because memory needs a place to sit, the Shahnameh gave people a bench long enough for all to share. Neighbors who disagreed in daily business still met inside the same scenes, repeated the same proverbs, and recognized the same turning points. That recognition is identity at ground level. We should acknowledge uncertainty and move on. Exact lines of transmission blur in the dust of centuries. Specific performances vanish as soon as they end. Attributions in old manuscripts sometimes tangle. Yet the shape of influence remains visible in copies, murals, school texts, and common speech. Finally, think of the book as a tool that designed a memory rather than as a relic. It stitched generations together through repetition. It dignified language through craft. It gave cities a stage on which to show who they were to themselves. In 1,000 rooms by 1,000 fires, it turned listeners into custodians. So the brazier glows, the page shines under a reed pen, and a child mouths a line that has balanced kings and households for a millennium. Values travel farther in stories than in orders, and the Shahnameh kept the route open. The takeaway is this: literature is soft infrastructure, a human-built road in memory that carries identity farther than stone and longer than rule. If this open case file sparked your curiosity about the maps we hold in words, like and subscribe for the next episode.